Hello, everyone, and welcome to Blogging Theology. Today, I'm delighted to talk to Professor Yasin Dutton. You're most welcome, sir.
Thank you.
Assalamu alaikum to you.
Wa alaikum assalam wa rahmatullah. It's good to be here. Yeah.
Very wonderful to have you on, sir. For those who don't know, Professor Yasin is Emeritus Professor of Arabic Studies at the School of Languages and Literatures at the University of Cape Town in South Africa. He's also taught at the universities of Oxford and Edinburgh. His special interests are the early development of Islamic law, particularly the school of Imam Malik, and the early development of various readings, qira'at of the Quran. His publications include The Origins of Islamic Law, the Quran, the Muwatta, and Medina al-Amal, Original Islam, Malik and the Madhab of Medina, and Early Islam in Medina, Malik and his Muwatta, as well as numerous articles on early Islamic law, early Quranic manuscripts, and the application of Islamic law in the modern world, particularly in relation to economic and environmental issues. He's currently researching on the Diwan, these are collected poems, of the 15th century Egyptian Sufi master Ali Wafa al-Iskandari, as well as certain other early Shadili texts. Now, today, Yasin has kindly agreed to discuss one of the most important texts in the whole of Islam, no less, and it's this one called Al-Muwatta of Imam Malik. There we go. That's one edition. This is the Aisha Bewley translation. There's actually a more recent one that's literally just come out a few months ago as well. So can you just introduce us to this seminal work?
The thing to bear in mind first is, where does it come from? What is its geographical origin? And the answer to that is quite simply Medina. So the Medina of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam and his companions. And Imam Malik was studying there, he was living there, he was teaching there, and the Muwatta represents his, I'm trying to think of the right word now, compilation of the knowledge that he had acquired there, and his presentation of that in, you could almost say, in a one-volume form. That conjures up another issue, which is that we are still talking about the time of books and writing. And Imam Malik is really indicating something that is not books and not writing, but is the actions of people. Right. So when we talk about the amal of the people of Medina, amal is a word that just means action, what people do or what people did, you could say, historically speaking. And so its importance is that it is the Medina of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam in action after the death of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam and through the first three praiseworthy generations. I say three praiseworthy generations because there's the famous hadith of it's the three generations, my generation, the ones after them, the ones after them. So that's why it's always considered the companions, the successors, and the successors of the successors. And Malik comes just after that. He's not that's a successor, but he learned from people who included.
He was really that early. So you have the first three successors. That the first is the best track, the generation, then the next best of the generation after that, and the next best of the generation after that. So that's the first three generations. Then you get Malik himself.
Yes, then you get to that time. Yes. Right. So he was born around the year 93 or something Hijri, and died the year 179. So it's that first century, first Hijri century, that is, if you like, the one that Malik is living in.
It's incredibly early. I mean, and we actually have, I was looking into this, we actually even have manuscripts of his work that are dated to his lifetime. And we actually have physical, we have that. We're able to have this physical connection with a man who was just three generations after the Prophet.
Yes, that is, you've said it in a nutshell. That's it. There are fragments. I mean, there isn't a complete manuscript, but there are fragments of the Muwatta from a very early period. And we're dealing with the book that comes from that.
Yeah, yeah. So, tell me more about the book itself. So, what is it? Is it a book of hadith? You mentioned about the actions, the amal of the people of Medina, which, for those who don't know, is located in what's called Saudi Arabia today, of course. Although Saudi Arabia didn't exist then, of course, Arabia
Yeah.
or the Hijaz, whatever. But so, is it a book of law? Is it a book of hadith? Is it a book of narrations about the actions of the people of Medina? What is it, or is it all of those and more? How do we classify it?
I think one has to say it is all of those and more.
Right.
Exactly. But it starts off with, it is a very sound book of hadith. That is without question accepted by the hadith scholars. And in fact, they say that Bukhari and Muslim built their books on the Muwatta, on the narrations recorded in the Muwatta. So it's a very solid collection. But Imam Malik didn't just include hadiths. He also included opinions of, I was going to say various people. That's a bit too vague, perhaps. He included opinions of his teachers, of his teachers' teachers, and more than just hadith. In other words, more than just. But let's just backtrack a bit. When we say hadith, most people understand a hadith with an isnad going back to the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Now, what you have in Malik is you have plenty of those, but you have other things, which is the isnad going back to the companions. That also is sort of fairly well known elsewhere. And you have isnads going back to the tabi'een and going back to the scholars of his age as well. So you have I'm tempted to use the word multiform, but that tends to have a different connotation. And it is a book of amal. So he will say sometimes, he says, this is the practice with us that I have found no disagreement about. This is what we do here. And he will have a number of phrases that he uses of that nature. This is the sunnah with us, about which there is no dispute, which I have found the people of our city following, and so on and so forth. So he will talk about the sunnah, and scholar Abdullah, who you may have come across and know about in the States, he many years ago did an excellent thesis where he indicated the importance of these terms, these so-called sunnah terms. And they do go back to the Prophet ﷺ, and or at the very least the time of the Prophet ﷺ, which in a sense is the same thing, because you have a group of people doing something in one place at one time, and that gets recorded in this textual form. So,
I know this is slightly off topic, but I just can't help be aware of the contrast between what you've just said. You said, well, why Medina? Medina was the place where the Prophet lived and established his polity, his society. That's where Islamic law was first, manifest in a natural governing system. The people knew him; he lived with them. That they learned from him how to live as good Muslims and so on. And in Medina, and so this is the very place that Imam Malik was just several generations later. The best place on earth, really, to learn. And what struck me was a contrast with someone called Jesus of Nazareth, obviously born in Palestine and in Galilee and so on. But his lived experience, the way he lived his life and so on, was quickly lost in the within a matter of just a few years, in the gentilization of the religion, where it was no longer, you're no longer imitating Jesus as a historical person, how he lived his life, how he dressed, how he behaved, that it became quite different. It was focused on alleged events, towards the end of his life. So we're no longer imitating the man, knowing the human being Jesus. That was completely lost. We don't even know how he looked. We don't even know how Jesus looked. There's no description of him. And yet, if you go to the Muwatta, there's actually a passage which describes how the Prophet, peace be upon him, actually looks. He looked like this. He wasn't too tall. He wasn't too short. He was this. He was that. The color of his hair. That's all there. Yet we have no idea how Jesus looked at all. And I know in churches you'll see pictures, usually of white people. I've noticed white guys, at least in England, for some reason.
Yeah,
he wasn't white at all. But but that's been lost. But in Islam, we even know what he looks like, thanks to the preserved texts of Imam Malik. And I think that's extraordinary.
Well, you've hit on another thing, which I think is absolutely critical, which is that we talk about the Prophet ﷺ and his companions. I often think about the importance of his companions, and that those are the people who kept company with him. And the definition of a companion is a Muslim, somebody who believed in Allah and the Prophet and saw the Prophet ﷺ. So he kept company in the sense that he actually saw him physically and believed in his message. And that is the companion. And what we have is a large number of companions. I don't know I wish I could give you a figure. I'm thinking of 10,000 weeping eyes. I think when the Prophet ﷺ died, or there were 20,000 weeping eyes and 10,000 companions, and everyone has two eyes. And that was how the transmission happened. That was how it took place. Because initially there were no hadith scholars, there were no bits of paper and this and that and the other. I mean, it was said later, very soon afterwards, you get fragments. But these people were keeping company with this man, with the Prophet ﷺ, learning from him, practicing according to what he was doing. As he said, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, pray as you see me doing the prayer.
Yeah.
Do Hajj as you see me doing Hajj.
Yeah.
And they had that advantage. They had that, again, I'm saying a nice positive word, but I can't think of it at the moment, but they had that gift that they were able to do it like that. So they had that. So there's the question of the company. Now, Jesus, I don't know, I'm not a scholar of the Christian church, but what I would assume from what I've heard is that even if you say 12 disciples, that's 12 individuals. That's not a community. What we have with Medina is we have many, many more than 12.
Yeah.
10,000, 20,000, whatever, who are living in a place at a time, who put the matter into practice.
Yeah. No, and that is a striking difference. I mean, another thing, without going into mentioning names, is a frequent motif, though, I've noticed in certain missionary polemics, that the earliest collection of hadith we have about Muhammad, hundreds of years, 200 or 300 years after the time of Muhammad, they say, in Bukhari and Muslim. And it's always struck me as very odd. I mean, there's one individual, I don't want to give him any notoriety by mentioning his name, but he even has apparently a PhD, who said this in a video recently about the huge gap between the historical Muhammad and the earliest hadith we have. And I'm left thinking, has he ever heard of Al-Muwatta? I mean, this is perhaps the earliest extant collection we have. And as you say, this is just 3 generations. I mean, the gap is much, much shorter. And this is very impressive. And isn't it the golden chain that it's called? Didn't someone call it the
golden chain of authority? Yes. Well, that's that's. I'm hesitating because I know there's Ibn Omar in it at the end. Nafi' from Ibn Omar from the Prophet ﷺ, and Nafi' is he's actually one of Imam Malik's main hadith teachers. So we have Malik from Nafi', the Mawla, that's the freed slave of Ibn Omar, from Ibn Omar, who was the son of the Caliph Omar, back to the Prophet ﷺ, because Ibn Omar got directly from the Prophet ﷺ. He got knowledge directly from him. So that's known as the golden chain of authority. Now that's in human terms as opposed to book terms. That's human talking to each other rather than written forms. But there is evidence. It's actually very good evidence, very strong evidence. I wish maybe I've even got it. If I can just lean over and
lean away,
because there are papyri in particular that are dated, and the best ones, if you like, are dated with both a Greek date and the Muslim date. So you can then collect the one with the other, or calibrate the one with the other, so you can say, oh yes, this is such a time. And again, there are, sorry, I have to take my glasses off so I can read, contrary to what people mostly imagine. Yes, there's epigraphic material that's been found recently in Saudi Arabia, which yields dates such as 23, 24. Now that's in Hijri terms. The
23 Hijra is after the Prophet actually emigrated then from Mecca to Medina during his own lifetime. Yes. So this 23 years
after his death.
That event. Oh, after.
Yeah. So that's maybe 10, 15 years after the death of the Prophet.
Yeah. So it's really. Oh, so this has been dated to within 10, 15 years of his death.
Yeah.
Right.
And this is referred to as the time when Omar died. So that links it in directly to the second Caliph Omar, the year when he died. And then there's 91 AH. The point is that there are dates to this material. And the one...
Sorry, we're talking about hadith material here?
No, this is, I mean, one case, there's a papyrus, it's PERF, P-E-R-F, I don't know what that relates to, 558. That's the numbering of the papyrus. And that's that cross-reference date I was talking about, using both Greek and Arabic Hijri dating, indicating a year 22 in Hijri terms. Wow. Now that means something happened 22 years before that.
Yeah.
Which is what we're talking about. And as I said, then there's these other ones of 23 and 24, etc. 91 age is also less in a different circumstance. So what we have is effectively a very strong historical record. Let's say historical. I was going to say textual. Let's not go down the textual route at this point. Let's just say a strong historical record and historical memories of these events. And if you counter that, if you try and suggest anything else, you have the evidence of history against you. I went to Medina not that long ago, maybe, let's say, I won't exaggerate, let's say 10 years ago or something like that. And I was shown a place called the Utum of Bani Waqif. I remember the name because we went there and visited it. And the man who was with us said, yes, that was where the Prophet ﷺ did the prayer, here, that place. And then we went to another place and said, this is where Ka'b ibn al-Ashraf, who was one of the enemies of the Prophet, this was where his Hisn, his stronghold, this is where his fortress was. And you can see the ruins, they're there. And in fact, and then, well, I won't, that would be a little bit polemical to put in that, but so these things are known about and have been, knowledge of them has been retained. And then you have a move from the spoken word to the written word. Now that's a whole other, if you like, that's a whole other talk. That's a whole other discussion. But one has to recognize that they didn't write books in that early period. That wasn't what they were interested in. They were interested in doing things. They were interested in action. They did have qadis, they had judges, they had people who were trying to carry out the law, but they weren't in the process of writing books. So it wasn't a sort of bookish culture until later. Now, Imam Malik comes at the beginning of that let's make it a book culture time.
Yeah.
Because that wasn't his, when he grew up, he wasn't writing loads and loads of books.
So the question is, well, what motivated Imam Malik then to put it in writing, given that the convention, it seems, was more an oral culture where knowledge was transmitted from person to person. The golden chain was an oral chain, you say, although it was ultimately written down. Bukhari, obviously, wrote, his famous hadith collection. So what motivated him to break with that tradition and write this famous book?
Well, that is the big question, and it's an extremely interesting question of that shift from spoken to written, or oral to written. Now, it happened with the Quran quite early, and then it also happened with what later becomes the Hadith. I'm not the expert on that particular side of things, although I have a sense of what happened because we have other scholars, particularly the other madhabs, like Imam Shafi'i is the kind of key person, I think, in many respects. And there becomes it's like you have to have a full isnad, and you have to have, ideally, you have a written isnad. And what was acceptable before turns out to not be acceptable. You can't just have what some market official was talking about. In fact, Imam Shafi'i uses these roughly these words. He says, how can I accept what some market official said, and I don't even know who he is? So Imam Shafi'i was expecting names and a link of names, one to the other, going back to the Prophet, which is that's when you get prophetic hadith. So then the hadith has to be not just the golden chain, but it has to be X from Y from Z that the Prophet said. And he said he's happy with that. If that X and Y and Z can be verified and trusted, he said, then I'm happy with that text. Then you have the question of how to interpret the text and how to act on the text. And it may be that there's more than one, it may be many things. So then you get the question of the scholars of the law, the different madhabs. So why is it, for example, we have Abu Hanifa, he's the earliest. Imam Malik, Imam Shafi'i, Imam Ahmad ibn Hanbal. Now they're in a line of development of this tradition that we're talking about.
No, these people actually knew each other, didn't they? I mean, there was a personal connection between. Is that true with all of them?
Definitely with. I mean, there's not polemics. That's the wrong word, but there's wanting your man to be top, sort of thing. So Ahmad ibn Hanbal, the other way around. Abu Hanifa, of the five, the four, what are known as the four madhabs, the four schools of law.
Of Sunni Islam,
of Sunni Islam, Now, they are, in a sense, you could say they're the big guys. Now, Abu Hanifa was in Kufa. We understand that he visited Medina. All Muslims would have tried to do that. He did that amongst the others. And it's understood that he met Malik and, was quite impressed by Malik and said this young sort of, how did he put it? Ashqar is the word in Arabic. It's a bit like sort of redhead or something like that. That's the word that gets used. What the actual meaning is in real terms, I would hesitate to say. And now Abu Hanifa died in the year 150.
Right.
The year 150 was the same year that Imam Shafi'i was born. And we said that Imam Malik was alive, born in the 90s of the first century and lived to 179. And then Imam Shafi'i is 150. So I think he died 241, something like 241, 204. Forget that, what I just said. Died in the year 204. So you have that period of, let's keep it simple. Let's say from 100, the year 100 through to the year 200. That is, if you like, the formative period of Islamic law. And then the next century after that, that's when you get the Bukhari, the Muslim, the Tirmidhi, the Nasa'i, and all the other hadith collections. So that's not until the effective, let's simplify again, call it the 3rd century. So maybe the beginning of the 3rd century going through to the end of the 3rd century. No, that's pretty much it. And Imam Malik and Imam Abu Hanifa, they're in the 2nd century. So that 2nd century is the real formative period, which then results in all of these books because people want to record. They know that, first of all, they would have had contact with other literate cultures. That, I think, is self-evident. And they would have seen the importance of preserving this knowledge. Beyond just people and actions, they would have seen a necessity to put it down in writing, which is what I think is the beginning of the story. That's what happened. Now, when Malik is putting his words down, those words are they're hadiths and they are people's actions. So they're both things. What tends to happen then, and again, I'm simplifying big time, but what tends to happen then is that things get systematized. So that instead of just having this sort of open-ended practice in the city of Medina with these people, some of which we know, some of which we don't know, you then have the sort of, if you like, the Shafi'ite thesis, if I'm correct in attributing it to Imam Shafi'i, whereby you need a solid isnad before you can hand on anything, before you can pass down anything as knowledge, as a text. And that does happen. That happens. So then you have the collections of Bukhari and Muslim. If you open Bukhari and Muslim, you're going to find from X, from Y, from Z, that the Prophet said, X, Y, Z, that the Prophet said, X, Y, Z, that the Prophet said. Everything is attributed back to the Prophet and nothing else is included. In the Muwatta, you might find Ibn Umar said, or Umar ibn al-Khattab said this, or he did that, or something. So you have a much broader, if you like, pool of scholars, and the whole process tends to get limited down. Right. I think, to use a rather, I hope it's a fair analogy, that's in a sense, now one has to be really careful here because people don't always understand, but that's in a sense what happens also with the Quran, with the text of the Quran. But in the early period, there's evidence of various, we're talking about variants, there's evidence of many variants. And then Sayyidina Uthman, the third caliph, said, no, he heard that there was dispute going on in Azerbaijan and various other places. We have to unite the people on one mushaf. Now, it doesn't mean one exact mushaf. Some people take it that it has to mean that, but no. It means one basic skeleton, and within that skeleton, there are various possibilities that are allowed that have been recorded from people. Now, if that happened with the Quran, imagine what the situation would be like a couple of hundred years later with other than the Quran. So,
this ambiguity, this ambiguity is something we're not, as modern people these days, always comfortable with, I think, isn't it? Because for some reason, in the classical Islam, it's something that people understood and were comfortable with. It was recognized by scholars, even rejoiced in by scholars. But now, we have this kind of, I'm not sure why, this very rationalistic, systemic kind of desire for absolute uniformity, and this is new. And this abhorrence of, in fact, there's a German scholar who recently wrote a book on this very question of ambiguity. I forget his name. In fact, I can see it over there. I won't get it out. But there has been this shift, this change in sensibilities, perhaps, about this issue.
Absolutely. And that's it. And that's, in a sense, that's the history of Islam. That putting one's knowledge of Islam, if you like, into that new framework, because the old framework is, no, that would be misunderstood, but it becomes a bookish enterprise.
Yes.
Whereas before it was, at the very least, more than that.
Yeah. Just touching very briefly, because it's something that will concern so-called modern people, is this whole thing about oral transmission of knowledge from person to person. It's not just you hear gossip. I mean, these are reputable, knowledgeable, acknowledged people who verbally, not textually, pass on knowledge, say hadith, for example.
Yes.
I mean, it's possibly the case that we, as I was saying, feel uneasy about that today. I mean, because we want something written down, although even that's kind of disappearing now. There's so much, we can change things, and the latest technology, we can manipulate photographs. Photographs are not reliable anymore. We can't trust them, I mean, as being necessarily authentic. There is this kind of doubt now in the air. But I mean, in terms of the oral transmission of knowledge, of the Quran, of course, which is Mutawatir, massively transmitted through hundreds of thousands of people from the beginning. So we know exactly, it's the Quran. It's not changed. But this oral transmission was key, wasn't it? But what was it reliable? What was it something that we can now look back? Because it's you mentioned the Muwatta is the first literary deposit.
Yeah.
Can we...
How do you know anything is reliable? I mean, everybody listening has to just think of that question. If somebody comes to you and says something, how do you know that's reliable? What is it in the human being that says, yes, I trust this person, I don't trust that person? There's that element. And in a sense, that is what Islam's all about. It's all about trusting other people. And I think again, one's in danger of going off into another sort of rabbit hole or tangent or whatever it is. But there is this question of, I mean, the English phrase, he's a man of his word. People will say that and they will mean it. At least they used to. Now, why is it that somebody can even claim that? And I used to think this with one's teachers, that you sit with your teachers and some of them have a love for the subject and a connection with the subject matter that comes across, and you trust them. Now, why do you trust them? What is it in the heart that says, yes, I can trust this man, I can trust this teacher, yes, this is a good teacher? Because that's what one experiences.
Mm-hmm.
Now, I don't know the theory of it. I'm not into sort of cognitive psychology or whatever it might be. And this is because there's a certain chemical in the body. I mean, I have no idea what that is, but I know that in practice, one trusts people. And the other thing is that you can remember something that your grandfather said.
Mm.
I can. I'm sure you can. And if you have documentation, then that's even stronger. But the thing is that there is a memory at work here. And that, I think, is part and parcel of the business.
And the criteria that people like Bukhari used was, checking the biography, did these people exist? Who were they? Could they have met the person they claimed to receive knowledge from? There were checks and more checks, to ensure the reliability, the authenticity, the integrity of the transmission process that happened orally. It wasn't just, I heard someone just say in the marketplace, write that down, that becomes my knowledge. It's not like that. So there was an attempt to make this a solid process, I guess.
Absolutely. And that's what one, in a sense, ends up with. I say ends up with because now the problem is, if you want to be a scholar of, I suppose, I don't know if that's the right word, but anybody who intends to be a scholar of Islam, he has to take on all of this, you could almost say, baggage. Now, I just wonder, was it like that in the beginning? I mean, I'm just putting the question. I'm not giving the answer because I don't know that one can give the answer. I'm alive now. They were alive then. But it has to be that, I mean, think of people's memories of the Prophet, but not their memories, their love. They had love for this man. If you have love for somebody, you think about them in a different way. You remember them in a different way. If you don't have love, so it's a completely different situation. You mentioned a few sort of detractors. I kind of asked myself, well, it's a bit unfortunate. They don't have love for this man. They don't have love for the subject. So how are they going to appreciate something that they don't have love for? I mean, again, jumping sideways, but I can remember as an undergraduate, well, I'm sure everybody knows, but you have teachers of Buddhism. They love Buddhism. Teachers of Chinese, they love Chinese. Teachers of this, they love it all. Teachers of Islam, well, fortunately, some of them had a very soft spot for Islam, but a lot of them, and across the country, for example, you find people that basically don't have no love for Islam whatsoever, no love for the Prophet whatsoever, no love for anything, and yet they're studying this thing their whole lives. You think, why are they studying that when they don't even have love for it? Well, go to something that you love. Do something that you love.
True. Yeah. I mean, when I was an undergraduate studying Christian theology in the Bible, I think all my teachers were Yeah, I think they were all Christians. They weren't all conservative. Some were very liberal, but nevertheless, they were kind of in that big, broad church called Christianity.
Yes.
There were no hostile atheists teaching Christianity. But in Islam, in the West anyway, in the Western Academy, I think most scholars are not even Muslim. I mean, they're non-Muslims, whereas most scholars of Christianity in the West are certainly Christian. Even Bar Ehrman, who's now an atheist, started as a biblical scholar, started off as a committed Christian. He was an evangelical of all things when he became a biblical scholar. Only later did he lose his faith. So even he doesn't kind of disprove the rule. So this is kind of an odd thing here, though. The average Muslim scholar, sorry, a scholar of Islam in the West is not a Muslim. The average Christian scholar of Christianity is a Christian. And this affects the whole way this is taught and perceived. And, you know, you talk about the love for the subject. There is no love for the subject in many of these people.
Yeah, it's a kind of strange situation. I mean, it's the one we're in.
Yeah.
But it is kind of, I just think of it as odd.
It is. I remember when I was doing this, one of my teachers taught me patristics. This is that kind of the early church theology. And he used to say, and when our Lord said this on this occasion, thinking, our Lord, you know, he was like, he referred to Jesus as our Lord in an academic class. It was, that was very striking, you know. But you wouldn't get the equivalent in Islamic context, you know. And as Muhammad, peace be upon him, said in this hadith of Bukhari, would one hear that in a seminar on Islam at Oxford or Cambridge or wherever? I probably not. I'm not saying we should or shouldn't. I'm just saying probably not.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. Yeah, it's not banned, but it's just not usual. Let's just say that. Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Just my only other question, really, and it's part two, if I may, is how is Muwatta relevant to us today? We've situated its historical context, the nature of the text, what it covers. It's the first formulation of Islamic law, amongst other things, the practice, the actions of the people of Medina at that time. But what can it? What is its relevance? What can it teach us today? And by today, I mean in 21st century, the West or the world. Are there different lessons from different places? But how do we engage this text or relate to this text as so-called modern people?
Well, that's obviously a very big question, but I think it's also a very important question. And I think that there is an answer, or at least there are answers to it. And it goes back to this question of what is amal? Amal means action. Now, did the Prophet ﷺ call people to words? No, he called people to actions. And I think that it might sound a little bit simplistic, but I also think it's true that the underlying ethos of the Muwatta is the ethos of acting upon this knowledge. And that's not the same as amassing the knowledge.
Right.
Act upon it is very different. In fact, again, I'm tempted to lean over and find one of these.
Lead away, as I said before.
Because it's the grandson of Abu Bakr. Now, we've mentioned the second Caliph Omar, we mentioned the third Caliph Uthman, and there's the first Caliph Abu Bakr. And his son, actually his grandson, was, I hate to be recorded as getting these things wrong, but is Muhammad ibn al-Qasim ibn Yes. So al-Qasim ibn Muhammad. So he's the grandson of the first Caliph Abu Bakr. Now he said, this is recorded in one of the things recorded in the Muwatta. He said, I remember a time when people were not impressed by words, to which Malik adds the comment that the reference is to action, al-amal, and that it's a person's actions that are looked at, not his words. Wow. Now, what we find nowadays, and what I'm, in danger of the same trap, and certainly most academics are in the same trap of relying on words. You give a lecture, you give a talk, you do this, do that, whereas it's really the action that matters. How can you talk about generosity and then not be generous, for example? Yes. How can you talk about honesty and not be honest? How can you, all of these qualities, now they're in a sense the real qualities of the human being. Now, the best academics, in my experience, they embody these qualities. They say what's true. They're generous. I'm trying to think of some other good qualities. Courageous, or whatever it is. These sort of things. Now, those people have a quality about them which not everybody does, but they are known by their actions and not their words. If they have some words as well, then that's a sort of added plus, if you like. But even if, again, this idea of your grandfather or grandmother, your grandparents, you remember them because they treated you in a certain way. And it was always forgiving and generous and overlooking your faults and and so on and so forth. That was just natural because they were your grandparents and they had that attitude towards you. But they also, well, I know mine anyway, they spoke the truth. Mm. In fact, one of my, I mean, this is autobiographical. I was trying to do some research on my forebears, and well, there are two particular people. My grandfather, he was imprisoned in Dartmoor at the time of the First World War because he was a conscientious, excuse my pronunciation, conscientious objector.
Right, right.
And that was considered traitorous or treacherous, or whatever the word is. You're supposed to fight for your country. He said, how can I go and kill people when God says thou shalt not kill? So
exactly.
That was
like Bertrand Russell, the great philosopher, who was also a conchi, to use the derogatory expression.
Yeah.
Conscientious objector, was also incarcerated for his crime of objecting to killing people. Yeah.
Yeah. So I mean, that for me has an important meaning, and I remember meeting him, and he had that quality about him. He was, a man of honesty. Wow. Now, if you recognize that in someone else, that you can have it in yourself, and you can also recognize where else you'll find it. Now, with the Muslims, I found that personally. I found all those qualities of talking about generosity, honesty. Okay, maybe the exception may exist. I'm not denying that there are exceptions around the. I'm not saying every Muslim, by virtue of being a Muslim, is automatically trustworthy and so on. I'm not claiming that. But all I'm getting at is a different experience of being human and recognizing the humanness in somebody else. And
I think, and like you, we're both English converts to Islam. In fact, we were born, without mentioning too many details, born in the same town in Essex. We're both from the same, as we discovered when we met. With a good grief, we're born in the same place. But what I find fascinating, and this is, a dour point really, as far as I'm concerned, is that everything you've said chimes very perfectly, I think, with the way Jesus is portrayed in the earlier Gospels. When he criticizes, say, the Pharisees for being like whitened sepulchres, this idea of like exterior, they said the right things, they looked good, well, maybe they looked pious, but inside they were, they were rotting corpses. The idea of a sepulchre is a grave, it's like a tomb. Inside they are dead and decaying. So and the emphasis on the interior motivations. So don't just not commit adultery, Sermon on the Mount, obviously, but don't lust after your neighbor's wife or something. Don't commit murder, but don't hate your neighbor, and so on. These extraordinary, what they call antitheses, but they're really just not really antitheses at all. They are just a deepening of the external to the interior, to the internal. But the point being, of course, is about behavior. So you're not just, I didn't kill that person, so I'm a righteous man. No, I didn't hate that person. I didn't manifest hatred towards that person. So as you say, you were kind or you were loving and so on. So the emphasis here, Jesus, and of course, he's not being unique. He's being a Jew, an Israelite. This is very Judaic. Emphasis on behavior, on action, on law as well is very Jewish in that classical Jewish biblical sense. I mean, I don't mean modern Jewish. I mean classical biblical Jewish way. So that there's definitely a convergence or a continuity between, just looking at historically here, between Jesus and Muhammad, peace be upon them both, in terms of what really mattered about being human. It wasn't about memorizing texts. It was living a certain way, manifesting those qualities of good qualities, which you spoke so beautifully about.
Well, I mean, I have to agree 100%. And I think that is the hadith of the Prophet. I was sent to complete the noble qualities of character.
That's right.
Now, that is, where do you find that anywhere else? I mean, if you were looking for it, would you find it in present day Christianity? I don't think so. Would you? I mean, again, I don't want to be polemical, because I mean, I'm happy with Islam, having found Islam, and the Muslims that I've met who've portrayed all these qualities. So, but that is the thing. Where is the most complete version of that view of humanity? And that is, again, it is amal. You see, that is action. That's what Abu Bakr's grandson was referring to, if you like. That says we weren't bothered with words. People can talk and talk and talk and talk and talk.
Yeah. Talk is easy. Talk is cheap.
Yeah. What are they going to do? And I have to ask myself that question as well.
Yeah.
So teaching is fortunately something which is at least praiseworthy in principle. So that's something that's worth doing. Writing, if you're writing for a good reason and you're putting across useful knowledge, etc., then that is also a good thing, I hope. But there are things that are higher than that, which if you like, the average Joe in the street probably knows automatically better than some scholars. And that is just word of kindness. So helping somebody across the road. Again, all the things that are in the hadith, they're there. They're sort of staring the Muslims in the face, really. They're not unusual either. They're known by other people as well. So somebody else listening could say, oh, in my tradition, we do exactly that. Maybe in the Buddhist tradition, they do exactly that. I don't know. But in a sense, it doesn't really matter, because you go for the best that you can get hold of at the time. And the best that I have got hold of is, alhamdulillah, shukrullah, the deen of the Prophet. I was sent to complete makarim al-akhlaq, the noble qualities of character. So our claim is that we complete that, but we say yes to Jesus. We say yes to Moses. We say yes to Abraham. We say yes to Noah. We say the 5 possessors of resolve, we call them. That's our name for them. Ulul Azmi, possessors of resolve. So Muhammad, sallallahu alayhi wasallam, Jesus, because Muhammad is known as the Habibullah, isn't he? The beloved of Allah. Jesus is the Ruhullah, the spirit of Allah. Musa is the Kalimullah, the one that was spoken to by Allah. Ibrahim is Khalilullah, he's the close friend of Allah. And Nuh is Najiullah, he's the one who's saved by Allah. So, I mean, they're in our tradition. We don't they're in the Muslim tradition. They're in the biblical tradition. How can I say? Potentially, or that's not the right word either. But for us, there's a complete history of prophets.
And the thing that many Western people don't grasp, coming back to this idea of actions and behavior, is that, okay, they think Islam is a religion. So you have Christianity as a religion, you have Buddhism, you have whatever. But that's not really to understand what Islam is at all, I would argue. It's a deen. A deen isn't religion in the sense of, well, I have my beliefs in my head and I go to my religious place on Sunday morning. It's not like that. It is a whole way of life. Yes, it incorporates religious aspects, of course, belief and prayer and so on. But it's much more than just that narrow Western conceptualization of what a religion is, like a private thing. It encompasses everything. Like the Sharia encompasses everything. everything that human being can be and do and say is encompassed because the Sharia. Sharia is not all to do with criminal law. That's very tiny. It's to do with how we pray, how we treat people, how we inheritance, our business transactions, etc.
Starts off with worship.
Yeah.
That Allah created man to worship him. So then the question is, how do you best do that?
Yeah.
But that's the start point. The start point is worship. And of course, that's also, it's anti-self, because you want to keep yourself out of it as much as possible. The more yourself is in it, the more you're not really worshipping God. You'll end up worshipping yourself or aggrandizing yourself. And we say, Allahu Akbar. I mean, it's simple, but it's not so simple. What does it really mean in life? It means that we make Allah the main focus of our activity, make it our qibla, our prayer direction. Well, for me, those are the things that tie together. And the book of Al-Muwatta is something that cuts through a little bit of the scholasticism and brings us back to the start point of what are you actually doing? What are you doing with your life? What are you doing with your limbs? What are you doing with your action, with your strength, and so on and so forth? And put that in the path of worship. That's what. So for me, that's what the Muwatta, in a sense, suggests. There's actually, again, we don't have time at the moment, and I haven't got the text that I want, but there's a wonderful text in the Muwatta where one of the companions, in other words, one of the people who kept company with the Prophet, a very famous companion, Ibn Mas'ud, he says, words to the effect of, you're in a time when X, and a time will come when Y. And you have these things, and you just think, whoa, the time that he's talking about that's going to come is the time that we're in now. He says, or maybe it's the other way around, maybe I'm quoting it wrong already. And so please, any listeners, excuse my lack of certainty with these texts. If I had them all memorized, I'd be able to just, quote them, but I don't. But maybe I can find it later and we can put it into the mix, because it's very good. But I mean, it starts off with when people will they keep their talk short and do lots of actions and be generous and not expect someone else to give them, and so on. So then the time will come, he says, where people will have long talks and they will expect things from other people, and so on. So there's 5 categories. I
know what you mean. And there's also hadith that say, which I've already alluded to, the best generation is my generation. But every succeeding generation is going downhill. It's getting worse and worse and worse until we hit the end times, which many people think we're in now. So it's going to be
in our own end times anyway, for ourselves, before our own deaths.
Yeah, this is true.
You're in your end time, I'm in my end time, all the listeners are in their end time now.
No, this is very true. And absolutely. So I think that's probably a wonderful note to end. As I said, we've been discussing Al-Muwatta by Imam Malik, Aisha Bewley translation. There's a new one by Mohammed Fadder. I forget.
Mohammed Fadder
from University of Toronto. You had the privilege of meeting back in February at Zaytuna. But he's produced a new what he calls a new critical edition of this text with much more kind of notes and critical apparatus than the Bewley one, a fresh new translation as well. Those are the only 2 translations I'm aware of in English anyway. But I found it very enjoyable just to dip in. Earlier I was reading the hadith of the description of the Prophet's appearance himself, how he looked. That's quite joyful just to one can dip into that as a layman, I think, and just gain some beautiful benefit, I think, from the text. So well, thank you very much indeed, sir, for your time. It's been an absolute pleasure to talk with you.
Excuse me of my uncertainties and rabbit hole diversions. Or
No, it was all a great pleasure. I thank you for your expertise. And just finally, you are, I understand, working on some poetry, some collected poems of
yes.
a 9th/15th century Egyptian Sufi master. Well, just very briefly, why did you pick on this particular collection of poems by this particular guy? Well, what was the reason?
My sheikh said to me, translate that book.
Okay.
And at first I didn't. And then I didn't have a copy of it. There's a copy in the British Library, so I got hold of that. And then somebody else that I met later, another sheikh, he heard that I was doing that, and he just gave me a copy, physical copy, the printed version. So I was able to then put them together. So I had a manuscript copy or a photocopy from the British Library and manuscript copy, and it's also available in 1 or 2 other places. And for readers and listeners, etc., if you go to Ali Wafa, Diwan of Ali Wafa.com, I think, you will find what I've done so far.
Oh.
It's up in the public domain. It's not a finished, it's not an edited final version, but it's what I've done so far. It's right. It's a long process. It's like 450 poems, and
that's a lot.
I've got past 50. I'm on to sort of like 60, and anyway. There's lots of difficulties with it, but
okay. Well, wish you the best. But best luck with
that. .com. Yeah.
Thank you. Well, that's great. So something we can look at as well. Well, thank you very much indeed for your time, Sir, again. And thank you.
Thanks very much for inviting me in the first place.
Until next time. Thank you. Assalamu alaikum.
Wa alaikum assalam wa rahmatullah.